think the best way to describe a BOLDR Globetrotter is that it's kind of like a Seiko turtle and a Rolex GMT master had a child, who then grew up and rebelled against subtlety by adopting a bigger and bolder personality, showing off its shape with industrial sharp geometric edges rather than the soft subtle curves you would normally find. For those of you that have followed my channel, you'll know that I've had an increasing interest in GMT watches, and when time came to choose one for myself, I went with the Glycine Airman. Yet even before I ordered that, I was contacted by BOLDR and asked if I'd like to be included on their watch tour of the BOLDR Globetrotter. But it took it a good while to get to me, so there's a chance you've seen this exact same watch before, as well as a chance you'll see it again after I send it on to the next reviewer. But if you have seen it before, hopefully you'll see something new here. Before we get to the specs, I do want to mention the strap, as I never really wore it on its stock strap. It's this cool molded rubber strap that actually has a deployment clasp with a diver's extension, which I think is actually a first for me to have a rubber strap with a diver's extension. But the trick is you actually have to put it together first, and in order to do that, you actually have to cut the strap in order to size it properly. Now, since this one is on loan, I really didn't want to ruin it for the next channel. So I can't really comment on it too much, other than it seems like a good quality strap. The rubber seems good, and it has a great clasp. Now, as for the Globetrotter itself, it is a bit large and a bit heavy. In fact, that's the first thing I really noticed about it when I picked it up, was the weight. The watch itself weighs 123 grams, and it just has this incredibly solid feel to it. Now with the rubber strap, I think it goes up to about 180. The Globetrotter is sized at 44 millimeters wide, and that's without the crown. So it's a little wide when it comes to divers, but not overly so. Now with the crown, it's closer to 45 millimeters, and that's because the crown is screwed down, signed, and just sort of tucked in there nicely at the 4 o'clock position. Lug to lug is a little long here at 53 millimeters, and it's also just a bit tall at 14.7. So again, it is a little larger than I would prefer. Lug and strap width is 22 millimeters, which is really standard for a diver of this size. And it does have a pretty good water resistance of 300 meters, so this makes a great option for when you're traveling somewhere warm and tropical. Now meanwhile, the price is $799 US, which may seem a little high until you take a look at what the other GMTs out there go for. Most seem to sit right around this price range, with just a handful of exceptions. The case is 316 stainless, and its shape would be what I'd call an industrial cushion. For me, it's reminiscent of a Seiko turtle, but it's a little longer, a little wider, and has these very angular lugs that just sweep down. And it's this case shape that may be the most polarizing thing about it. And it's a shape that's also similar to some other watches from BOLDR. But it's that case shape that also helps the Globetrotter wear just a little bit smaller than it actually is. The case is brushed throughout, and the finishing is actually pretty good. The only exception might be in between the lugs, where it's a tad sharp. But if you use the stock straps, you won't ever notice that. On the rear, we have a closed screw-down case back, and it's embossed with this very nice design that's just fitting for a watch destined to travel the Earth. Now the exception to the brushed finish is actually on the bezel itself, and that bezel is just really tall and striking. The edge of it features ridges that actually give it a really good grip, but there's these small polished areas in between the ridges, which I think contrasts nicely with the angular brush finishing of the case. The bezel is bidirectional, and it's only 60 click, but it does have a nice feel and audible sound to it. And a lot of people do prefer 120 click on a diver's watch, but do remember that this is a 24-hour GMT bezel, so really it's actually 2.5 times more than you would need. The only issue where 120 click really comes in handy is if the bezel isn't lined up perfectly, but here it's pretty good. And I do want to mention that I really appreciate the bezel being bidirectional for a GMT. Even on a GMT, some other brands stick with the unidirectional bezel, and it's a little more difficult than it needs to be. As you can see, this is the Batman version, with a black and blue ceramic bezel. And that ceramic is really good and bad. The good, which does outweigh the bad, is the increased scratch resistance of the ceramic. But the bad side of it is that ceramic is very reflective. The blue side is actually pretty good, and I do love the way it looks. but the black is just really reflective, almost to the point that sometimes it just looks like a mirror. It all depends on the light. And yes, the bezel insert is loomed, and quite nicely actually, but we'll get to that in a minute. The crystal is this flat sapphire, and just below that sits a raised chapter ring. And when I say raised, I really mean raised, as this thing is closer to the crystal than the dial itself. And it's highly polished with the 24-hour indicators, so it's really for the GMT hand. And I think that polish really creates a nice effect with the light, especially against the flat matte black dial. And that flat matte black dial I actually found very interesting to film, especially on a watch like this, where you would really expect more of a deep reflective metallic or sunburst effect, whereas this one is just flat. But I think it looks brilliant with the white accents against it. And I think it also emphasizes the real point of this watch, that it's far more of a tool, something rugged and bold, rather than the typical looks you get with a subby or a subby homage. The indices are raised, and they do have a good amount of loom with a silver outline, which is then surrounded by this painted minute track. And I also really appreciate the very small indice at the fore next to the date wheel, as some other companies just would have left it blank with the date wheel alone. And as for that date wheel, it is small, and it's white text on a black background, which I think can make it harder to read, but I think that choice really helps it blend into the design. The hour and minute hands are sword-shaped, and they do follow the same pattern as the indices, silver with white loom, while the GMT hand is more of a contrast in colors with this flat blue arrow, and that GMT hand on the Globetrotter can be moved independently from the hour hand. And further contrast in color is a very orange syringe second hand that sweeps the dial. The length of the hands here I think is perfect for the size of the dial. The hour hands go right to the indice, and the minute and second hand go just to the edge of that raised chapter ring. Another thing I like is that the text on the dial is rather small and unobtrusive, and at the bottom it's so small that it's really hard to read, which in some ways is actually a good thing because no one ever really does. Meanwhile, the logo is at the top, and it does clearly identify the brand without taking up too much space. Overall, I do like the dial design of the Globetrotter, and I especially appreciate the contrast, and that's contrast not only in color, but in light as well, when you look at the silver outline of the hands and the indices against the matte black dial. And comparing this to my Glycine Airman, I think this one is far easier on the eyes, as well as easier to read. And the only real complaint I would have against the Globetrotter's dial is that I think it does seem a little small for the case. But that's primarily because the case does have this really weighty, beefy look to it, and that's followed by that really tall, wide bezel. So in some ways, both of those do seem to overpower the dial itself, and especially when you look at the large drop between the chapter ring and the dial. So on to loom, and BOLDR generally does not skimp out on the loom, and the Globetrotter is no exception. The loom is good, there's no other way of saying it, and it's really good on the hands, the dial, and the bezel itself, and it's this nice bright light blue BGW9 Swiss Superluminova. Now for comparison, I did put it up against my Seiko Turtle, as well as an Orient Kamasu, and my Hamilton Khaki King. And the Globetrotter is easily as bright as the other two divers, but I think it's actually clearer and easier to read with that light blue loom. And that stays true even after 40 minutes, with the loom on the bezel almost at the same intensity as that on the dial, so I can easily say that this should last you through the night. Now movement-wise, we do have an ETA 2893-2, which if you're familiar with GMT movements, there really isn't much to say. It and its Sellita counterparts are really the main GMT movements you'll find in this price range. So it's a true GMT with around 40-hour power reserve, as well as your hacking and hand winding. And as I previously mentioned, you can independently adjust the GMT hand. And you accomplish that by moving the crown out to the first position and rotating up. Now if you're not familiar with how to use a GMT, I'll link a tutorial video I made down below. But as for how the Globetrotter wears, well, it's better than you would expect from its size. And the cushion-like case and low-hanging lugs definitely help, although not quite to the same effect as they do on a Seiko Turtle, as here the lug is much longer. So I think it does overhang my wrist just slightly. So I think the watch would actually wear much better on its silicone strap, as they're highly angled when they're put in it. so I think it would really hug your wrist nicely. But as I said earlier, I didn't try it, so I can't say that for certain. Now the Globetrotter would look great with a variety of NATO straps, but at this height, I'm always a little shy about using one as I think it makes it too tall. But I did try it on a variety of other straps, including a NATO. And one of the issues I found across all of them is that if you like to wear your watch just slightly loose like I do, the weight of the watch just tends to make it flop around a little bit. So this really does need to be worn tight, which again I think that stock strap with the diver's extension would really help. So out of the straps I tried, the best one I found was actually an elastic one from the Watch Steward. And with those straps, your wrist is actually in contact with the back of the case, so it doesn't add any extra height, but the elastic does keep it nice and snug. And on that strap, I did think the Globetrotter was a bit heavy, but I think it was fairly comfortable to wear. It still, however, might be a little bit bigger than I would like with my 7-inch wrist, but I think it's still very manageable, especially if you just love a watch that has a big, bold presence. After all, the company isn't called BOLDR for nothing, and I think BOLDR's done a good job here of creating a great looking watch with a utilitarian tool watch look, but with just a few refined touches, which is in stark contrast to say my Airman, which is all business so to speak. And I think that big bold presence of the Globetrotter is one of its greatest assets, so I think it really separates it apart from a lot of the other GMT watches out there. Yet at the same time, I think it might be its biggest liability. And that's for two reasons. The first is the obvious one, that some people just want a smaller, lighter watch. And the second is more about travel, as for me, the ideal GMT watch is an ideal travel companion. And here the BOLDR Globetrotter's height might wind up being a bit of a liability. Now if you're heading somewhere nice, sunny and warm, it could be the perfect watch. Short sleeves, warm beaches, lots of water, it's basically in its element. But if any part of your journey takes you somewhere colder, not so much. And I can tell you that firsthand as I lived in Wisconsin for a few years. And during those years, about every January, we'd take a trip somewhere more tropical, either the Gulf of Mexico or maybe the Caribbean. And while it was nice and warm at our destination, it was still freezing cold back in Chicago where we were flying out of. And in that type of travel situation, layers are your best friend. And layers and a big tall watch don't always go together. So for me, the ideal GMT is something that's easy to wear in almost any situation. And here it would be something a little thinner, which is one of the reasons I really like my Airman. Although I'll admit that the Globetrotter definitely has it beat in the looks department. So sometimes you really have to pick and choose what's more important. I will say, however, that I think BOLDR did a great job with the quality as well as the design, and I'm really eager to see some more of their automatics, especially this new Odyssey with its very minimal bezel and California dial. Anyway, let me know what you think about the BOLDR Globetrotter in a comment down below, as well as just BOLDR in general. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for joining me.